Let's see, where's my clicker? Now, first of all, can you all hear me back there? Yes. Yeah, because even though I'm a teacher, sometimes people tell me I have a quiet voice, and so raise your hand if you're not hearing me. I'm also going to encourage, though I noticed that just like in class, the front rows are kind of empty. And I'm not going to call on you just because you're on the front row, but actually if you're willing to move up a little from those back rows, that would be wonderful. Thank you. And sometimes people come in late too, especially to something like this. They didn't know all the good food that was going to be here, and they, grabbing dinner at home, and so then that frees up things for them too. But yeah, first of all, I am so thrilled that the Institute brought me back, because I have really nice memories of being here in the Berkshires. I won't even say how long. Well, let's see, you said it wasn't quite 30 years ago, but it was a long time ago. And it's, there have been a lot of changes, and I'd say many very positive ones. A lot of the wonderful things, at least so far, that I'm seeing here at the Institute. I haven't yet gotten a chance to explore the whole area, but the Institute is still as lovely as ever, and yet a lot of really positive changes, and new staff are here that were not here in the past, and so it's really nice to see that. And it's nice to see so many of you come out on a really lovely summer evening just to watch, pictures about it. I appreciate that. So what I'm going to try to do is talk for maybe just half of the time that we have. I hope I can keep myself to that. And then leave the rest for questions, because, one of the things I want to hear is your perspectives. I ambitiously titled this Bound for the Berkshires, but I don't really know that much about this area. I have my nice memories from the past. I've certainly studied a lot about economic development in general, and about tourism and rural economies somewhat, and we have them in Colorado too. But the specifics, you're going to be the ones to interject that in and ask me, well, how does this work in this situation? I'm looking forward to that. So feel free to ask questions as I go along. If it's something that we're going to get to later, I'll just tell you that. We're going to get back to that later. Let's hold that till the end. But, maybe it's a good time to clarify a point or bring something up. And so we'll just kind of play it by ear like that. So yeah, ambitious title, and you're going to help me with it, right, to talk about the issues for economic development. I should say the subtitle of our book, and I meant to bring extra copies, but I didn't. But if you're interested, it's on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. You can buy online, and I think by this point, they've cut the price a little. But the subtitle of it is Quality of Life and Sustainability, because one of the things I saw in our community was that it seemed like you had one group of people working on economic development, and then another group of people saying, but our quality of life is going down, kind of as you were saying, Steve. And then the sustainability is even different, and it's like, wait a minute, shouldn't this all be going together? If people are interested in all of these things, shouldn't they be working on them in a unified way? Because I'm convinced also, and as Steve said, I have that experience of being an elected official and seeing, what happens with, you got to balance the budget every year and all that. And I think it's wasteful. A lot of the time, the reason we probably spend more in local government than we need to is you have people undoing each other's problems instead of just working together to start with. Maybe they could have done it more efficiently. So just from that, save money thing. So let's see if all my clickers are working and everything. So yeah. So basically, this is just a little overview about what we're going to talk about tonight. The difference between economic development and economic growth. People use those terms interchangeably a lot, but there's a very specific meaning in economics for economic development. Even a lot of economists are sloppy sometimes and do this. And I'm kind of a believer in, if you have two different words, let them mean different things. You don't necessarily. Well, they've got the air conditioning working now. Maybe I'll look more formal, although Steve said, this is kind of like Colorado, right? You don't have to look formal, but that's good. It was warm when I came in. And then really about what I call a percolate up strategy, because as much as you have a beautiful area, and we find that with a lot of places in Colorado too, we love the natural beauty, we want to protect them, but also we want people to be able to earn a decent living too, And if you're only protecting the environment or quality of life and not getting a a good living for people. That's not what you want. And then how to make development sustainable in an economic and environmental and social way, all of those ways. And lastly, a little bit about how you can use indicators, community indicators, to shift the conversation. Now, why do you need to shift the conversation? Well, because of the fact that, and I found this really interesting when I came to this as an economist. I had studied economic development courses in the university, and yeah. By the way, how many economists do we have here? I forgot to ask that. Come on, there's some of you students. I mean, you can call yourself economists even if you haven't finished your degree. I mean, you're right. And then yes, I wanted to get a little bit of a sense of the audience. And then how many people do we have who are working for a private business, which would include banks and, yeah. Nonprofits? Yeah. Local or state government? Okay, we got a few. Retired? Okay. And yeah, we know there's some students. And how many of you live here full-time all year round? A lot, okay. Anybody this is their second home, just here part of the time? A couple of people, okay, yeah. And how many of you have been in the area? I'll let you decide what a long time. How many of you would call yourself long-time residents? And how many of you would say, well, I'm fairly new to the area? Well, we all have a pretty interesting mix there, okay. But anyway, so as an economist, I took economic development courses, and we, of course, focused on third world countries, right? They're the ones that need developing, right? And then when I got into politics and was looking, and I'm like, wait a minute, what is this economic development stuff that's going on at the local and state level? I hadn't really even paid attention to it before. And the stuff they're doing seems really strange to me. It doesn't fit with what I learned in economics about development at all. And so then, no surprise, I found out, well, they're not economists running it. It's, just kind of ad hoc business people, et cetera. And a lot of the time they're practicing what I would kind of call folk economics. That it makes sense when you first hear it, yeah, sure, that makes sense. But if you really know very much about how the economy works and think about it, it kind of doesn't make sense. And so that is really kind of what led me to start working on it first in our area, and then to put it all into a book with the help of my co-author, that how can we really apply economic principles and some new ones that economists weren't paying enough attention to, and really in a more scientific way look at how economic development works. So traditionally, if we think about the way it's practiced by either a lot of city, state, do you all have counties here, or is it just?
Yeah, still sort of.
Okay, but
no county government.
because you have townships. Right. I had to remind myself as I was driving up the other day, it's like, it says you're in this township, and it's like, how come there's nothing here? And then I realized, oh yeah, this is kind of like they do in Europe, where it's probably a good idea. The township authority goes to the line, even though it's rural, because anyway, we do it differently in the West. But so sometimes, and do you have nonprofit groups that are economic development people too? Yeah. But then also local governments are doing it. So I'm calling that the traditional, because as I said, the economists were just ignoring it. And then while they were ignoring it, other people got busy and did other stuff. And it has been, just increase the rate of growth in income or employment, which sounds good, right? First blush, you'd say, well, sure, that sounds good, to get more jobs or increase the rate of growth in income. But actually, I'm going to explain not necessarily. I mean, there are cases where maybe that isn't such a good thing to do. But a bigger question is, how do you do it? And so the first one is, that sounds good too, right? Keep taxes low. I mean, how many people like low taxes? But but of course, as you can imagine, the trade-off becomes, are you going to have bad schools because you're keeping taxes low? It's kind of all. So keep the taxes low and minimize regulation. Be business friendly. That's another thing, that they would push. And again, some kinds of regulation are good, some are not good. So, you would need a little bit more nuanced approach to that. But then specifically what it's associated with is giving location incentives, which are usually tax breaks. They could sometimes be the city actually builds like a highway interchange for a plant, or they renovate a building. So they might sometimes spend money, but usually it's a tax incentive. And again, actually, I don't think he's here tonight, but I just had somebody on the staff talk to me this afternoon and said, I don't understand why our local government doesn't do more of that. And I said to him, well, actually, the evidence is that doesn't really work very well. But again, it sounds so intuitive to people, like, sure, you give people an incentive, get them to move there, why not? So maybe you all, I'm probably preaching to the choir and some of this stuff, you already know it. So why do I have this picture of this lovely buck up here for economic development? Because a lot of the economic development, as it's practiced, is sort of what's out there to bag. And so that has led to a characterization. I'm going to talk about economic gardening. Anybody heard of that phrase? Yeah. And of course, they were the ones who kind of labeled this hunting. So you're seeing what company out there and how can we, and then actually the companies start competing, the cities and states start competing with each other, and then you get a race to the bottom. That's part of the problem. And actually, that's how I really got into it. And actually, my first year at the legislature, we have a part-time legislature. That's how I was able to keep teaching at the university in the fall and serve in the legislature in the spring. But then the governor can call you back into special session. And United Airlines, you all may remember this. This was about 20 years ago, when I was a mere child. But the United Airlines was looking for these big tax breaks to locate a facility. And so we got called back for that. And I just thought, I started bringing in this stuff that the Federal Reserve had put together about why, how the evidence that it didn't work. And we weren't able to kill the deal. It was bipartisan, really, because that was kind of nice. It's always nicer when things aren't a partisan fight, who was for it and who was against it. But we were actually able, I take this as a success, we were able to weaken the deal, weaken the incentives enough that United went elsewhere. They either went to Indianapolis or Lexington, I can't remember which. But whichever it was, within a couple of years, the city was so sorry. Because you can imagine, if everybody's bidding for them, think about it logically. If everybody's bidding for them, in the end, the final bid, at best, even if you really knew what you were doing, is going to have like practically zero profit, like a competitive market. And of course, what often happens is the final bid, they've overbid. So, that was great that United didn't come. But that got me kind of interested in what was going on. Okay, another hunting picture, because what economic developers have often been criticized about doing is and from their perspective, you kind of understand why they do that. They're often like, am I doing my job? How many companies did I bring, right? And if anybody comes, of course you want to say that it's what you did that brought them, But in fact, when economists study this, and we have actually in the second chapter of the book, we review an awful lot of the, and by the way, I think in pretty plain English. But it's this book that's written for people that aren't economists, and it just has a lot of footnotes. And if you're an economist, and you're like, well, I don't know about that, then you can go into the footnote and read more. But anyway, the studies really just show that that's very typical, that you overpay, and that most of the time, that incentive, even though the business isn't going to turn it down, because hey, why not get $1 million tax break? But it isn't really what made them move there. Generally, they're much more interested in, actually workforce would be a lot of it, sometimes location. It all depends what they're making. Steve?
Well, Daphne, you just said that UA went to some other place because the tax incentive was better than in Denver.
Yeah, but the place was very sorry. Within a couple of years, there were stories in the Wall Street Journal about it, they realized they had paid too much.
But did the company stay and create jobs in the area location?
Not for long, not anywhere near like what they said they would do. And that's actually, if you're interested in this stuff, there's a website called Good Jobs First, and I think it came out of a book called Good Jobs First. And one of the things he points out, Greg Leroy, is that, and this is kind of amazing, that states and cities hardly ever set up a mechanism to track what actually happened. Or they're starting to a little bit now because of his efforts, the clawbacks. But yeah, they hadn't done that, and that actually was such a big deal. So yeah, definitely the highest bidder might get them. Not always,
In
but
this case, in the case of UA, the economics were irrelevant to them regarding the location. And at the end of the day, they decided that the marginal differences were small enough that the tax benefit caused them to go there.
yeah, I think they wanted to be at a certain kind of airport, and Denver was building a new airport. But it ended up that they paid too much, basically, which is, and actually, well, I think back when I was in graduate school, I remember my professor saying, and this was at the University of Oklahoma, but he said, it was Wirehouse Lumber Company, you all can relate to that around here, and he said, the minute the tax break's over, Weyerhaeuser leaves. And it's just, this is the way it always works. So, but anyway, we have a lot of documentation about that. But so generally, okay, I see what you're saying. Doesn't quite fit with what I'm saying here. Generally, other factors are more important. But yeah, sometimes, because that was a big one, they will go. But then if everybody knows about it and everybody's competing, you have to ask themselves in the end, will I have paid too much? Kind of like when the stock market's going up too fast, right? Everybody's like, I got to jump on that stock, and so, okay, I'll pay more than the other guy did. And at some point, you're paying too much, But the excitement factor, you can imagine. It gets into we want to land them. And so then you end up, with not really, there's been a lot of research showing that there's never a fiscal benefit to the city, ever. This is pretty amazing. Because they always end up, even though they talk about, okay, this will create jobs and the people will pay, income taxes if it's the state or different things, still the tax revenue they give up seems to always be more. And usually there's additional infrastructure or service costs that come with the people. That's what's kind of interesting. I remember pointing that out to people at the legislature, and they were kind of amazed. I said, some of these jobs, you're talking about the high-paying maintenance jobs, but some of these jobs are lower-level paying jobs, and do people making that much money even pay enough in state taxes? And they just had never thought about that, And so I did have the legislative economist run the numbers, and was like, no, this was 20 years ago, so you'll have to inflate the numbers. But no, somebody making $25,000, maybe that's the equivalent of, I don't know, $32,000 now. It's like, no, they don't pay their way in taxes? No. But if they're already here, we're not going to say you have to move. I mean, this is America, right? But it's like, why would you want to attract somebody making that little money? Because on average, they're just not going to pay enough. And so that was, but and then but I was going to say sometimes, and actually Tim Bartik at the Upjohn Institute has done a lot of interesting work, a lot of which we cite, and he says about the only time. It's always a money loser for the state or local government, but sometimes it does help the local economy, which is different. And that would be in the case of, say, like a Detroit, that you've got all these people that moved out, you've got infrastructure that's already there, you're not going to have to build new infrastructure, and if you could just get people to move in and start occupying those properties and moving, then you can see that it could be a benefit, So you need to have a lot of unemployment, not just slightly above the national average, and workers that are there that are already skilled. But usually companies figure that out on their own. Usually companies figure out, but they may not, sometimes, you could argue, okay, there could be reasons to give incentives in those cases. But again, that's not the situation you all face. That's not what we face in Colorado. We're talking about depressed cities or maybe Appalachia, maybe rural areas. And I think that was the other thing that amazed me. I thought, why does a place that has so much going for it think it has to do this? Anyway. It's pretty strange because people move there as we'll get. But anyway, that has resulted in what's called the economic base model being very popular, and which is bring in primary jobs that export out. And again, that makes basic sense to people. They go like, yeah, if you produce a product you could export out of the Berkshires, then you could bring new money in, that would infuse the economy. But one of the problems is really for any new companies you bring in, again, nationwide, only about 2 of 10 jobs go to local residents. Usually it means you've got to bring in a lot of new people. Now, if you're a landowner, That might sound pretty darn good because the land values are going to go up, and like some of the people that support it in Colorado Springs, they own a lot of apartments. So that's good, the rents on the apartments go up and the apartments are full and all that. But that's really not your average citizen. So you're starting to see kind of who might be in favor of it. Landowners are going to benefit even if a lot of the jobs are going to new people that are moving in. Because as I said, usually if you had a workforce here that could already do it, some company would have figured that out and said, there's people that are unemployed or underemployed there, and we can get them to work for a little bit less than they do in Boston or Worcester or wherever, And so they figure that. That's kind of the free market. They figure that out themselves. And then, of course, the problem, and I'm sure that's an issue that you have here, just like we do in Colorado, there can be positive effects on quality of life from having that growth in population, but there can also be negative effects too, And we can talk about that more later if you want. But I'm sure you can just imagine some of those. And so what's going to happen there? But I think the most important point that I wanted to make at this time is that there's really alternatives to this. Because again, a lot of the economic developers talk as if the only thing you can do is create these export industries. And in fact, again, I thought, wait a minute, that's not the way we learned in economics, And there's really three ways you can do it. You can do what's called import substitution, right? We talk about that with underdeveloped countries as, hey, the same stuff is true here, right? We need to apply more of this development economics to our own country. In other words, let's say that people in the Berkshires are driving out of the region in order to shop at big box stores. And so you have one now somewhere in the region. And so they aren't, you're no longer, because even if you go out to get it, that's still an import, right? Or if you're, a better example. You have any wineries around here? Speaking of wine? Yeah, okay, not a big, but it can imagine like there were no wineries, and so all the wine was being imported. Breweries, I bet you got microbreweries, yeah. Although we started that in Colorado, but again, if now you start actually having some that are produced here, and so more of the little bars and taverns and restaurants are buying within. So you're substituting something you produce here for that thing you used to import. And that creates jobs and a multiplier just as much as whether you're exporting. There's nothing really magic about whether you're taking a product and exporting it. You could also just be producing it here and not importing as much. Or, and this is so common sense to economists, but most people have a little bit harder time with this, or you could just be raising the general productivity of everything that everybody in this region does. Like, what kinds of things do you produce here? Tourism. What? Yeah, but do they still produce some textiles here? Okay, yeah. So again, if you actually raise the worker productivity of people in the textile or paper mills, what should happen, and we'll get to that in a minute because it doesn't seem like it's been happening as much lately, but what should happen is their pay goes up. Generally, worker productivity goes up, pay goes up. And if their pay goes up, what happens? They start going out to dinner more, and they start, buying the things around here. And so again, you get that multiplier effect within the economy. So you don't even actually, the second one down here, so this is like different kind of new industry. This isn't even a new industry. It's just produce better within the industry, huh?
Let me challenge that
Okay.
a little bit on something I just heard on NPR.
Okay.
This is NPR economics,
Yeah.
so not necessarily totally robust. Productivity since the 70s in the U.S. has gone up 70, 80%.
Mm-hmm.
Worker wages have gone up in the single digits.
Mm-hmm. No, that's what I was saying. I'll get to that in a minute. Yeah, because you're absolutely right. One of the big stories, I don't want to get too far off on that track tonight, but maybe we'll need to. But I just was writing about it in another book that's coming out soon. But that's one of the big stories since the 70s, and one of the fundamental problems we need to address in America in general is why isn't productivity growth translating into wage growth? But if you don't have productivity growth, you can't have wage growth, right? We definitely have to have that, huh?
The quick response, and I've heard this for years now, and I did a little productivity analysis myself. If you look at the wages of the industries where productivity is growing, If you take total average wages of the
Yeah.
economy, definitely wages are going down because a lot of industries aren't growing in productivity. In industries where productivity is actually measured well,
Uh-huh.
manufacturing, some other places, there's a closer connection. I'm not going to say it's dollar for dollar. There's a much closer connection in productivity growth and wages. You look at the firms and the industries where productivity growth is happening rather than take the average. Because we're creating a lot of jobs, low-wage jobs here, which is diminishing. Now, I'm not saying that's a total connection, but there is,
Yeah.
it does get watered down by that fact.
But no, and I'm glad you brought that up, because again, as I said, this is kind of the simple Econ 101, and it is true that if you don't have productivity growth, it can't happen, but you're also right that something is different in the last 30 years or so in the U.S., and we'll get into that a little bit later. I guess I better move myself along here. But back to this idea that 8 of the 10 jobs will go to people outside the area, at least what I found, you can tell me if this is true here too, that most people in Colorado, when I would present, say, well, isn't more population always better for the economy? I mean, doesn't population growth always make the economy grow? And the answer is no, I mean, from an economic logical basis. But I think the reason why we confuse them is that if you look at the history of the United States, we had this, we're moving from the eastern seaboard here, right? We had this land growth and population growth and economic growth all going on at the same time. And that's what happened for a couple of hundred years. They were kind of all going on together. Because economic growth would mean per capita income is increasing. But they were all occurring simultaneously. So maybe people in other countries look at it differently. I don't really know. But so we tend to kind of assume they all go together, but not necessarily. That was just kind of a historical accident that they all went together.
I just want to mention, and I'm no expert on these things, but reading about a large percentage of second home owners here, and I'm from the northwest corner of Connecticut. So we don't have more people with houses being occupied by second homes. And really people that in that economy take care of them.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, that as you have, and again, there are other parts of Colorado that are kind of like that, but not where I live, but that, yeah, they're not really, your count as population in your primary residence, you might actually be spending 4 or 5 months a year in the other one, but yeah, so, but if you just think of kind of more the simple case of, you got more people, is it going to drive per capita income up? And this is kind of an amazing statistic that we cite in our book, that if you look at the 1990s, one of the big high growth periods in recent economic history, the 10 fastest growing states in population had less per capita income growth on average than the 10 slowest growing states. The fast growing states were actually ones like Nevada. Now Colorado was kind of an exception because it actually had pretty good income growth. It was a fast-growing one, but you look at like what's happening in Las Vegas, you can kind of imagine. And actually, a lot of the slower-growing states were in the east, but they actually had higher income growth. So how could that happen? Well, maybe I don't think we can use your example for all of that because it's not all a tourist area. But actually, probably part of that was productivity growth. Like if you think about the Boston area, productivity growth and high tech, and so. Maybe as a state, I don't know, did Massachusetts have population growth? Not very much, but it had really good income growth, So that actually, you start looking at those real cases, and whereas Nevada had enormous population growth, but a lot of it was low-wage jobs. And so they did not have good income growth, It was pretty, they had a little bit. Almost everybody had a little bit of income growth in the 90s, but nowhere like. And so we can look at that and say, obviously that doesn't work, because per capita income, and actually when I first started showing people this in Colorado Springs, they couldn't believe it, that in the 80s, which was kind of like a bad period for us, our per capita income growth was higher than it was in the 90s when we had tons of population moving to town. Because again, kind of jobs. Sometimes in a slow population growth period, the people that aren't doing very well leave and go somewhere else. And so actually, in terms of your per capita income, it's actually going up, But so just kind of realizing that they don't necessarily go together. And then of course, even once we get past income, let's say you are even getting income growth, but are the jobs coming with health insurance or pensions or sick leave or parental leave or those kinds of things. Or, you know, the famous things about the town gets the Walmart, but then a lot more people are on food stamps, and that's more of an income thing. But so thinking about that, what's the quality of the job? And then from the point of view of local governments, and again, maybe you have a more rational tax structure here than we have in Colorado, but we definitely do not there. And we can have rapid population growth, and it does not mean that our tax base grows enough to keep up with the population growth. And again, trying to get, because local governments think, well, I've got more people, my tax base is going to grow. Well, it'll usually grow a little bit, but does it grow as fast as the new roads you need to build and new schools you need to build and all of those things? Not necessarily. I mean, you have to really kind of run the numbers. And actually, if you just think about it ahead of time, you can usually model it and get a pretty good idea, but people are so sure they know what's going to happen. Like, we don't need to look at that, right? We know we'll be better off.
We had a problem where no matter the size of the class for students, this is a small town, Falls Village, with the unions, the teachers had to have their class and be paid. And I think there was, a request statewide maybe to not make the salaries have to increase every year. Possibly to start factoring if you have 10 students in a class that was initially 20 or down to 8 or 7, that you could decrease the cost of the education.
Well, and actually, I don't know if I'd advocate that, but actually there's a real good example where in that case, it would be a benefit to get more people in, because that's kind of the fixed cost thing. You're already having to teach, you want to teach one calculus course in the high school, your school's so small. And so there's a case where almost, you could see incentives could kind of work if you could calibrate them correctly, because you could spread the cost of that teacher over more people. It's kind of like I was saying about Detroit having all that empty infrastructure. But most of the time, I guess and I have to admit, my co-author and I both live in the West, where in these boom communities where all these things are happening. So it's always good for us to challenge ourselves to see how do these things work in areas that are, things are a little different. But yeah, in those kinds of cases, it might be a benefit to get some more people. As long as it's, of course, you can't control it, right? Then all of a sudden it's like, what? Wait a minute, now we need a second calculus teacher. Okay, but there is another approach. No, you can't grow money. Look good. There is another approach. If we're saying all these things, it doesn't work. But at least try to grow the businesses that you have instead of hunting for more. And that has come to be called economic gardening. And some of you said you were familiar with it. And that actually, it was Chris Gibbons in Littleton, Colorado, who, it was actually in the Denver area that they first came up with that idea. I'm not going to say we have applied it more than other people, but you know how it is. You're not a prophet is without honor in their own country. But it's kind of become popular all around the world. The idea that focus on the businesses, instead of hunting, focus on growing what you have. Certainly that gives you more economic stability. That's one benefit, because remember I was saying that the business that, and maybe you all have had it here, and we've been having it lately, that businesses will threaten, if you don't give us this money, they're already here. If you don't give us this money, we're going to leave, So you can get into sort of the little drug addict thing, with the incentives that they're hooked on that and asking for it. But you're just not as vulnerable to people leaving, because guess what? How many people in here are either own a small business or have somebody in the family that does? Yeah. And people pick where they're going to have the business. I mean, they want to make money there, but a lot of the time they like living there, right? They have some kind of attachment to the community. And so they're just definitely not going to be the one like United that, switched because of something like that. They're also not big enough to get those. So you get more economic stability because they're committed to other things there. And you also get, I'm sure most of you know this, you get more job creation with smaller businesses than you do with the really big businesses that are the ones that really have the money. And let me mention that too, that it's kind of amazing that part of the problem with the tax incentives is that there are people that kind of work both sides of the fence. These location consultants get paid by the companies, but they don't have to disclose that to local governments, and they don't have to register as a lobbyist. That would be the number one reform, I would say. You got to register as a lobbyist, and then do your thing if you want to. I mean, it's a free country, and so the local governments often don't understand that the consultants are maybe playing different cities against each other and trying to up the amount that they can get them, because that gets them paid more. And those are but they're not going to mess around with the small businesses, because how many jobs? In total, they create more jobs, but this one's creating 5 jobs, this one's creating 20 jobs. I mean, it's not worth giving tax incentive. Back here?
Is that more long-term? Does that go along with long-term, or is that just short-term?
Actually, even short-term.
That's both?
Yeah, there's more. If we look at where most of the jobs, and that's really been true in this last recession, more of the jobs are coming, even though a lot of small businesses go out of business too, so their jobs may turn over, but you still get more net jobs from small businesses than big.
Sorry, I don't quite understand what does it mean by hunting. You mean it's from government's perspective? That
Yeah.
they're trying to bring in new economic
Right.
industry to the local area?
Yeah. Now, of course, they didn't call it hunting. The economic gardening people said we're gardening instead of hunting. Remember that shoot anything that flies, claim anything that lands. So that, in other words, instead of trying to, or you can think of, you put out lures when you're hunting sometimes, right? Anybody a hunter that puts out? So you put out the lure, which is the tax incentive, and see, who you can get in. So it's basically saying, well, these people they're saying they're going to create 200 jobs.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can land them.
Yeah.
Rather than, okay, here are local businesses that are doing things, and let's see how we can, without picking winners and losers. That's the other thing that's really important, because it's amazing how many people say they're free market, but then they want to pick winners and losers in the economic development thing. And actually, it's fascinating, because all the way across the spectrum, from liberal to conservative, all economists agree it doesn't work. I mean, how many things do you find that on, right? That you don't find that on macroeconomic policy, but that economists all across the spectrum are agreeing, and yet somehow the public policy is still marching on the other way. It's a little depressing if you're an economist. You kind of like Rodney Dangerfield, right? We get no respect.
I think you're missing what the incentive is to the politicians.
Mm-hmm. They want to show they landed a job.
2 to 4 year time
Yeah.
that they're working from. They want to claim credit for things, and it doesn't matter how they do it. Being able to claim credit is what they're after.
Oh, I know, because I was there.
It has nothing to do with
Yeah.
It has to do with political reasons.
But the reality is, because I'm a real believer in this, we do have an imperfect but a democracy, right? And if most people understood that didn't make sense, they wouldn't be rewarding politicians for doing that. And so somehow most people don't really get it, And that's kind of where I would say that the salvation comes in, people saying, well, I don't want you to spend your time on that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I was there, and so I can kind of sympathize with it to a degree, because what are you doing about jobs, in a downturn? Oh, well, here's what I did. And then you can say, here's what I did. And actually, since nobody tracks it, who knows how successful it was, plus people will have forgotten and moved on to other things. Whereas if you just say, well, I really worked to make sure that the quality of, the first couple of grades in school was a lot better, so that kids would get a good foundation. How sexy is that, right? But that's what really works, right? So I guess, again, it's like until the public gets a little more sophisticated and understands, it's like you're going to have people doing that kind of stuff.
Too much misinformation out there with
Yeah.
advertising and, creating jobs. There's so much misleading information. I think
Yeah.
more general education for the public is what we need to do.
Yeah, and they do a lot of that here at the
We need a
institute.
research institute that educates the public on the economy.
Right. But actually you can Google this and you'll definitely find a lot more job creation with small business, even with the churning, even with the fact that many small businesses fail, but still on net. And most of the jobs that people have with them, they can just move on to another business. That's kind of what happens. I mean, one restaurant fails, what are the people that do their work? They go to another restaurant that opens later, right? But, and obviously not all small businesses are restaurants. But then I think the other important thing, because this is getting to the quality of life part, that it really changes the character of a community. Do you only have large employers, or do you have a lot of small employers that have more local investment in things? And again, you can probably appreciate that here, because I imagine you have more of the more local, smaller employers, right? But maybe didn't in the old days with the paper mills and things. But this is definitely one of the problems we have in Colorado Springs, because we have the big military base, and well, they create jobs, but they're not going to support the art. And I don't know if that's, I guess people do go to the Air Force Academy, but it's not a big visitor attraction. And we have a lot of nonprofits. They're great, but they don't donate, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. Didn't intend to shoot my host in the foot, but anyway. But we at one point, that was our economic development strategy: attract all these nonprofits because they're clean industry. And then finally, like, wait a minute, duh! It's like private profit-making businesses are the ones that are going to give to the symphony or something. You might want to have more of those. So, but I think also the smaller businesses, and that's why people come to the Berkshires, right? That they don't want to go, and it's like, oh man, they have the best Walmart in the state, I mean, you might want to go to buy something there. I'm not going to get into whether or not you should buy from Walmart, but it's definitely not. But whereas you want to walk down the street with the little shops and go to the different restaurant, and I think it's interesting all the stuff you're doing with the agriculture and farm to table and all that. We have a little bit of that going in Colorado too, but how that's becoming a real tourist draw, and who would have thought, right? I mean, 10 or 15 years ago, you would say, oh, that is so blue sky, that's going to go nowhere. But so that you tend to get more of that. Again, there's all different kinds of businesses. They don't all attract visitors. But so back to actually now finally to our first point, after all that background about how we go in the wrong direction. As I said, sometimes economists use these terms interchangeably, but economic growth is just a increase in average income. Increase in per capita income is how we measure economic growth, right? Like the GDP, did it go up? Whereas economic development, I think most economists would agree, is a process. When we apply it to underdeveloped countries, we say they need to go through a process, right? That's what they're struggling with in Egypt, right? Get your institutions right, and the whole process to where on an ongoing basis you will have a better life for people. And it doesn't happen, that's a big leap when you're talking about countries that haven't had it before. But there's variations between different parts of the country on that too, even though we have the same political system. But so that process of economic development this is how we define it in the book, that economic development is a widespread and a sustainable increase in the standard of living. And I can still remember the professor who taught me that years ago. He was so thrilled when I told him the book came out, and that because I remember him standing up there saying, economic growth is not economic development. I'm like, what? And if this process is not going on and you aren't truly improving people's lives in a way that's sustainable, and a lot of people, because per capita income, I mean, you could have think of one of the oil countries, and the sheiks are super rich and everybody else is poor, and their per capita income looks really great. But but we know it's like that's not a developed country, right? Uh-huh.
Seems like a lot of the slides that you're talking about are sort of more relevant, maybe easier to track in a goods-based economy, especially when you're comparing it to an international model. I'm wondering if your research cuts across, just increasingly service-based economy.
Oh yeah, definitely. And actually, that's a lot of the time the small businesses are the service-oriented ones. Because if you think about it, I mean, there are economies of scale in producing goods. And so a lot of the time you are going to have big companies doing that. But the services that, for instance, just think of the farming example, right? If you're producing commodity wheat, you want the really big, they've turned out to be industrial producers. But if you're producing artisan cheese or, now that was actually goods. But I mean, but an awful lot of services are small scale because they require either a human touch or quality, extensive quality monitoring, right? Like if you want.
But that's true for goods too.
Yeah.
I mean, in the Berkshires, there's a specialty plastics.
Okay.
They're very small firms.
Mm-hmm.
pay the highest wages in the region,
Yeah, and that's the kind you want,
you know.
right?
But they're not, they're not out there competing on running off gazillions of CD cases. That's not their line of work.
Right. But they're going to be better for you economically, even though you need several like that, because they're paying the high wages. Yeah. But no, it applies really to all of them. Let me go on. Okay, so there are 3 ways that economic development differs from growth in income. And actually this is, people often use the words income and standard of living in an equivalent way, even a lot of economists, and so that I've just become kind of a stickler on that. We have a word for income, we know what that means, so why would we want to call the standard of living the same thing? Because I think if most of you, if you think about your standard of living, you know it's more than income, right? It has a lot to do with various factors of quality of life. If you have family in the area that help take care of your kids, you don't need as much income to be able to get to your job, and you factor that in. You say, oh, I can stay here at this job that doesn't pay quite as much because, my mom or my aunt or whoever is taking care of. If you're growing your own vegetables or hunting or whatever, you don't need as much money for food, right, that you spend on food as you would otherwise. So there's sometimes these non-market factors substitute for income, and other times they're just things we value, right? I mean, again, I would bet that incomes are lower here, right, than they are in Boston. And part of that is cost of living is lower, but part of it isn't that, right? Part of it is people just say, because we have the same thing in Colorado, we call it the Pikes Peak effect in Colorado Springs. You're going to be there and look at the peak, you got to pay for it, right? And so same thing. And it works because the reality is people are willing to, whether it's that they think they have a slower paced lifestyle, or I can get to the outdoors faster, or again, maybe there's all these farmers markets I can go to. And so people look at a mix. I guess that's kind of what I'm saying. And income is certainly important in it, but it's not the only thing. And if you do things that drive up people's income, and this is kind of hard to explain to the economic development people sometimes, in order to raise the incomes of people here to what they are in Boston, you're going to degrade the quality of life a lot, and you're going to drive people's costs up too. Because basically, more and more people are going to keep coming for that until it's not worth it anymore. Anyway, so maybe I'm getting into too much economic stuff there, but so that is, I think, the first factor, and then we'll come back to the other two, that improvements must be widespread throughout the population and sustainable. So we've already been talking about some of this, so I should start. It kind of depends on the sort of growth, just as you were saying. What kinds of companies are you attracting that's causing your growth? Who is it who benefits from it, right? Is it just the chic in Connecticut, or or is it a broader group of people? And then always, I guess, having been an elected official, I think about this, you got to, it's amazing how many people in local government don't think about that, though. What about these public services you're going to have to pay? At one point, actually, there was a public initiative to pass, this was right before I went to the legislature, to pass gambling in these 3 little mountain towns. And actually, the legislature had turned that down twice. And then they put it on, we have the initiative, kind of like California. But, and again, I was kind of like, those are gorgeous little mountain towns that if they would just work on themselves a little bit, they could be better tourism destinations. What in the world? It's like, I understand why Atlantic City did it. It was kind of a dump, but why would you want to do it? That's kind of what I was saying earlier. Why would you want to do it in this area that has so much going for it, And then, within the first few months, they started coming. I was on the committee that they would come to, and they'd say, well, we're having a lot more, traffic problems and social service problems and all of these things, and so we need some, and we all just said, I was glad to see both Republicans and Democrats, sorry, we don't have any money, and you guys wanted it. We told you it was not going to be a good idea. But, so it's kind of sad, actually. We can laugh about it, but it's kind of sad. And again, the public needs to just be savvy enough to not push their, representatives to do that, or even let them do it. And then obviously again, getting how much are you damaging the environment or the society, the social factors too. And is that outweighing, everybody likes to have higher income, but how much are they giving up? And there's no one answer to this, right? You got to think about it in each case. Are you having just a little bit of environmental damage and a whole lot of income increase? Or are you having just a little bit of income increase and a whole lot of environmental damage, But to just think about them, how they go together, because really, I think we're finally kind of starting to get past that now, this idea that the economy and the environment are opposed to each other. Because actually, that's why I love this picture, that, somebody said to me, the economy is at the center of it all, but the economy is just part of society, right? You can't have an economy without the whole structure of society, families and legal institutions and all those other things. I mean, actually, that's what Russia, good example, right? That's the one I use with my students, although it's getting too long. They can't remember the fall of the Soviet Union, but it's kind of like, if you don't have that whole infrastructure there, that made a lot of people in the West wake up and realize that. If you don't have that whole, both that formal and informal social capital, you can't have. Then you end up with, this, what do they call it? Crony capitalism or, yeah. Anyway. But then, of course, we're paying more attention to that these days. We're within the environment. We're not separate from the environment. We're within the environment, and of course, the whole. So I think that's kind of important to realize. But so improvements must also be widespread. And favorite son of Massachusetts there, but where was he speaking? About 60 miles south of where I live in Pueblo, Colorado. This is the famous speech where Kennedy said, "A rising tide lifts all boats." And I actually started looking it up because you can find it on the web and confirm that, because everybody's using that all the time. In fact, people will say Ronald Reagan said it, but he didn't. I mean, he might have, but he wasn't the first one that said that. So, and I think that's true. I mean, that was certainly what I learned, that when we were talking about underdeveloped countries, the fact that their average income goes up doesn't mean anything if it's all going to the sheiks. It's like, is it going to a large group of people, that most people are benefiting? And the reason Kennedy said that is that when he was speaking back in the 60s, that's what had been happening. That coming out of the Great Depression all the way through the 40s and 50s and 60s, and actually it continued on into the 70s, the time they were mentioning, everybody was getting better off. There were still people that were poor and people that were rich, but pretty much everybody was getting better off. And then that changed fundamentally in the mid-70s, and that's a whole nother topic that people are still trying to figure out why. But part of it, and then that, whether that was the cause or was reflected in that productivity growth didn't seem to be going to workers as much. So here's kind of, right, more what our economy looks like now. You could think of this as, but this isn't just the top 1%, but what was happening, actually it started in the 80s, that kind of people at the bottom weren't doing very well, and then they weren't getting increases even though the economy was doing better. And then by the 90s, it was the middle class wasn't getting the increases even though things were going better. And then actually, since about 2000, even in the top 10% of people, it's mostly going to the top 1%. So we don't need to cry for the other 9%. They're top 9% doing okay, right? Probably a lot of them in this room, but not really the ones that are. In fact, there was one year, when was it? One of the stock market boom years, the entire growth of the U.S. economy went to the top 0.1%. Just, it's kind of astounding. It was, basically stock market profits, and those were like the big CEO bonuses and stuff, financial stuff. But you guys are closer to that than we are. But so the rising tide hasn't been working in the same way. And then, is it sustainable? And I'm going to try to getting close to wrapping up here. Because the other point we make in our book is that you've got to focus on all the kinds of capital, that traditionally economists have focused on private business capital, which is important, and the market handles that pretty well. And then we started realizing, actually after World War II, when people saw how countries like Germany recovered so fast, even though their infrastructure had been destroyed in the war, and they started realizing, yeah, but for the people who were still there, they still had their education or their skills, and so the human capital that's in people is very valuable, their skills. And then we're coming a little belatedly to this, but maybe many of you know, we haven't been investing this in infrastructure. Actually, for the last 30 years or so, we've been underinvesting in our infrastructure in the United States. You see these things about the civil engineers say are, like, I don't know what Massachusetts is, but most states are like D or D plus in terms of their, if you're there, you've got a lot of company, but it still won't mean that if the bridge falls down, it won't hurt you, just because there's a lot of other states. But that's another kind of capital, and private businesses can't really be productive if they don't have that, that infrastructure to operate in. We sort of take for granted, right, that we drive down the road. And I mean, in a lot of underdeveloped countries, that if you're going to drive a truck, you have to know how to change a tire, right? Because you are likely to drive through, you know how to change a tire here too, but you have to be able to do a lot more because the roads are dangerous and damaging. And so you're going to pay the driver to be doing that. And a lot of the time they don't make it, right? And then natural capital, natural resources are also a kind of capital. And this was kind of the Russia example that I already gave, that I think we started realizing you've got to have the right institutions in a society, and that kind of trust and sort of informal pressure that there isn't a policeman looking over our shoulder all the time, but it's like, is there an ethical way to do business that you're going to be? Now we've been, I don't know, I hope they're getting better. We've been kind of like evolving toward that on Wall Street, haven't we? We're like kind of working toward crony capitalism, huh?
I was wondering if you might add the technical, the whole internet, because they're saying, I think I heard on NPR too, that maybe Obama won the campaign because a few computer geeks got in the room and made sure the numbers, people knew about all on the internet. And so the idea that people are, and I don't want to get into politics so much, but the idea, most people know we buy the lobbyists, buy the Congress people, or whatever.
Yeah.
It's criminal. It's not representing America.
So you're saying, how does it, okay.
I'm just saying, we're trying to say we're going to have a nice, semi-legal, ethical society, but we don't.
Oh, well, no, that's what I was saying. I think we are starting to have some of the things that we used to say are mostly in underdeveloped countries, right? The inequality, the corruption. And so we really kind of need to look at that and say, well, how well does that work in underdeveloped countries, and do we really want to go down that path, But actually what I thought you were getting toward, this is it's a nice way to think about these different capital stocks, but technological knowledge, you can think of as sort of this intangible that affects all of them, right? Because it affects, obviously it affects business, it affects the way we train people, it affects, right, we got smart roads now where you can, I think that's really cool, where you can get the bulletins up there that tell you that there's an accident up ahead, that's great, right? So there can be, technology really affects all of these,
There's a private infrastructure. The internet, the electronic infrastructure, a lot of it's private. So
Right.
It's an interesting dilemma. It's interesting new, and a lot of it relies on public infrastructure, but there's this whole new thing our economy relies on is that a lot of electronic infrastructure is private.
Yeah.
Private companies, and the investments by companies that have to make a profit and what have you.
That's an excellent point, because as technology changes, things that we would have said had to be public sector, now they're infrastructure, but they're, for the most part, private. Yeah.
Although we had to subsidize, I think, to get fiber optic out here.
The beginning of it, yeah. So the beginning of it might have been. So again, I think this is like some people kind of wandering here, but the, when people have these fixed ideas about, like they'll try to pass these things in states sometimes, government should only be X% of the economy. And I tell them, well, that's crazy, because there may be things.
We're talking in terms of a place like the Berkshires, where it's a moderate economy. The opportunity for a sustainable economy has a lot to do with being able to communicate beyond here
Right.
with internet technology. But the population density makes it uneconomic for the private sector to bring the fiber optics or the other systems here. So the government has decided to subsidize internet and other kind of electronics, so it's an interesting dilemma for a place like this. It's not a backwater like someplace in northern Maine, but it still required a public investment to get the kind of economic infrastructure to be able to do sustainable economics.
Yeah, so actually there's public and private elements to that. And I think there are some, and I think Chattanooga, I was just reading about the other day, they have made the whole entire city, Wi-Fi is free. And that's basically what they're doing to try to revitalize, because it was an older industrial center that then was, not doing very well. And so that, again, that helps small businesses, that helps attract bigger ones. And so that would be the argument I would make, that if government is going to be involved, that's the kind of stuff they should do rather than giving a tax break to X company. You spend the money on this thing that benefits everyone, and then you let the businesses shake out who does well and who doesn't, et cetera. And actually even the people that aren't businesses benefit from it too. They don't have to pay for that.
I think on a number of these, there are issues of, there's sort of at the macro, say national and state scale, there are certain things that work. And then when you start to translate those to specific, much smaller economies, there are places that the market no longer works very well. I think there are, infrastructure is one of those. When you think about the railroad infrastructure in this country, well, in the 19th century when it was built, it was heavily subsidized.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, a good part of it.
And then later, actually a lot of the time government subsidizes things and then they become private once they start making money.
Right.
And
certainly that was true for the telecommunications system until maybe the 90s in the Northeast, and then they said, wait a minute, we can invest these dollars somewhere else and make a whole lot more money. So the return on investment isn't enough, or the rate of return on investment isn't enough to attract private capital. So you have to start to figure out ways to deal with those kinds of, and that goes for private investment as well. When we're hearing that, Wall Street wants to see a return on a capital investment of a couple of years.
Yeah.
And yet probably most of us as individuals would say, well, gee, if I got all my money back in 4, 5, 6 years, I'd probably be reasonably happy if it's productive at the end of that.
Yeah, that's
kind of extending or the shrinking of rate of return gets in the way of some things.
And why we've become more short-term oriented, that's kind of a whole other topic. But yeah, private industry used to be more long-term oriented. And that, so it's almost kind of like creating this place where government needs to get more involved, that if it would just be a little longer thinking, they wouldn't have to. But you got a lot of interesting ideas there, and I forgot. I was flipping ahead because I thought I was going to get to where you were talking about, but I didn't. But we talked about productivity growth of being the key, and again, you've got to really improve all these capital stocks. As I was saying, you got to have roads to drive on, you got to have people to hire, but this gets to what you were saying about I would argue that for the economy to be sustainable, and I think that is, more and more people feel like they don't have buy-in to the U.S. economy. This isn't a local problem, but it's everywhere, because they aren't because typically people think of productivity like you're paid for your own productivity, but actually for most of you, think of the jobs you're in. How in the world would they ever measure your productivity? It's really hard. If you're on your but even on a manufacturing line, it's intermingled with all the other people there, right? And it depends on the equipment that the guy or woman who owns the factory, had. And so your productivity, we think of it in kind of a moralistic sense, but actually typically it's economy, when the economy is, let's say, getting productivity gains of 2% a year, most workers get, on average, there's a 2% a year gain for most workers. Now, in really, industries are doing really well, they get a little more than 2%. Industries aren't doing well, they get a little less than 2%. But very much thanks to one of the graduate student whizzes here. Let's see, where is she? Who helped me? Ying, who helped, yes, right. Helped me find these good pictures on the web today. Because that when you're making coffee, we learned that the old percolate coffee isn't that good, right? That some of us grew up with. And the drip coffee is a lot tastier, right? But for the economy, it's a different story. The trickle-down economics, which is like the drip coffee, isn't a step from percolate up economics. I'll leave you to think about. Because, yeah, okay. I've been taking so many questions. I'll use that as my rationale. Because think about, again, that there's a lot of cost to having workers that aren't, we were talking about how many low-wage workers there are. They aren't able to pay for the services. Somebody else is either going to pay the taxes to pay for their services, or you're going to have, kids that don't have insurance and health care, and that's going to end up being a problem later on, so it's kind of like the old pay me now or pay me later. If more people, and this first struck me at the legislature, I thought, Colorado's pretty cheap actually on how we help low-income people, but we still spend a lot of money. There was still a lot of money going for hospitals that took care of the indigent and people, foster parents, and all these kinds of things. And I thought, if we could just kind of like half of the people that are needing that could be helped to move upward to higher wage jobs, or even if they aren't, maybe their kids can. Like, it wouldn't be such a drain, And that's another kind of economic development, basically. I mean, that struck me. I thought, nobody thinks that's that exciting. They want to bring in a company. But if somebody goes from being dependent on government services to now they aren't, or now they're a net taxpayer, hey, that's economic development. That's money running around the community. So, because all these things we end up, paying for. And so that's kind of since then, of course, a lot more people are talking about that, the Walmart. Now, applying it to the Berkshires here, okay, so I better do a little bit of this. First of all, we were talking about tourism is a kind of export, because the people are traveling here and bringing their money. You don't have to ship the good to them. But, you're still getting that kind of dollars coming in from the outside, as I'm sure you talk about. And it seems to me, at least from what I know about the area, you're doing it in a smart way. You have more locally controlled tourism, because there is, just like when we talk about local agriculture and industrial agriculture, it's the same thing is true with tourism, right? Is there any areas out here that do have what you'd call an industrial tourism, where it's like Disney World, like a large scale, yeah. And so you're smart about that, right? You've kind of...
Cranwell is not industrial tourism.
Yeah, okay. And so you're going to tend to have, basically, you're going to tend to have more local businesses benefiting from it, right? And more of the dollars staying in the local economy. And so the good part is you have a lot of incentives to preserve quality of life, because I'm sure you realize that's why people have second homes here, or that's why they travel here and, want to be here. The bad part is, of course, you get a lot of low-wage service jobs in the, tourism industry. So that's kind of the question: what do you do to improve those? But who was it I was talking about earlier today that there are thinking about ways to raise the level of the kind of tourism you're doing, like the sustainable agriculture, because I see that, I'm seeing that around me in Colorado too, that it's like the people that are doing it, they have college degrees. It's not like they couldn't do something else. And sometimes they did go away and do something else for a while, and then they decided, no, we want to come back and, have these goats and start this cheese factory and, little cheese. And they're making good money, So there, I'm sure there are other things that we wouldn't imagine in the past. Well, lastly, often economists, when I first started working on this, a lot of economists didn't like the quality of life stuff, because they said, well, you can't measure it, and then the response might be, but I guess the reason I'm paying attention to it is I think, well, it's important to people. If it's important to people, maybe that was my, experience in politics. It's like, well, economists might say this doesn't make any sense, but guess what? People care about it, and it affects their decision and whether they want to do this or not. So it is part of economics. That's what I would argue. So a lot of people would say, well, can't you just ask people what their quality of life is? Well, it turns out that doesn't work very well, because actually all across the country, somewhere between 83 and 87% of people say their quality of life is good to excellent, which is, I could say, oh, that's positive, right? This was pre-recession, but I don't even know if it's changed that much. But of course, why are people saying that, whether they live in, Chattanooga or Appalachia or Pittsfield or Denver? It means different things to different people, right? And a lot of what people are reporting really is about their own health or their own personal relationships. It isn't really about the kinds of things that local governments or local policy can control. It's individual stuff. So you don't get a very good response by asking them that. Now, the way that economists have typically studied it, they look at if people are leaving, they look at how much people value what we call amenities, because they say if more people are leaving places with higher wages, like Boston or New York, and they're coming to places with lower wages, like maybe around here, even though the house price is less, but as you all were saying, not enough to compensate for the whole thing, right? It's part of it. Then people must value amenities. Because, for a long time, the economic models were all that people move to where the jobs are. And that seemed to be true, And now that's not happening anymore. People move to where and jobs are kind of following people. These companies, like the tech companies, because they don't have to be in a certain place, they're saying, well, if people want to live, that's kind of where we benefited from it in Colorado. If people want to come out here and be able to ride their mountain bikes and hike and we can pay them less, it's like, yeah, let's go there. And so that, but that's all very nice. It's interesting economics, but it doesn't tell you how to preserve or improve quality of life, right? It just says move to where and most of the time communities are concerned about how do we protect or improve our quality of life, not, this thing about people moving. That's all very intellectually interesting to an academic. But so that's actually how I got into the local indicator stuff. I'll close with that. And do you all have anything like that? Any projects that try to look at basically? A lot of the time they're called community indicators. Sometimes they're quality of life. Sometimes they're sustainability indicators. But they're all the same thing. And traditionally, we've had a lot of economic indicators, actually ever since the Great Depression. Right? Before that, we had no idea what was going on with the economy. People just guessed at it, right? I mean, it's really pretty amazing. And so it's a pretty impressive set of data now that is collected. And so local areas know what their unemployment rate is and their housing starts and all that. And that's nice, but that's not the whole picture, right? And the problem is that sometimes we respond to what's there, and so that's all that local governments are paying attention to sometimes. So what about indicators that tell us more about what's going on in the society and the environment? Now actually back since the 70s, there's a certain amount of environmental data collected because of the EPA that you can get. But if the EPA didn't collect it, like if there's open space measures, that's up to the local government because EPA doesn't collect that. So this is kind of what all of these indicator projects do is they try to look at what's of concern in the area. They're individually tailored rather than there's advantages to a federal program. They pay for it, right? And it goes on from year to year. But on the other hand, it might not measure what's important to you. And I would imagine these two are important to you, open space and sprawl and land use, just like the R does. But those are just examples. And then even in the economic area, there's a lot of things that don't get measured in the conventional data, like what's the comparison between wages and rents or, income and house prices. And actually the last chapter of our book, really that's what we've done is summarize with some of these other ones I'm going to tell you about, that what the different ones that different communities chose. The social level is important too, right, to people. That when people are talking about their quality of life, they're also talking about, I like this community, I feel at home here. So you have to use surveys for things like this, and hopefully they're telling the truth on these surveys, right? But what percent of people say they talk to their neighbors regularly? Or what percent of people say they feel like they could ask for help, from somebody down the street? There's measures to look at the quality of daycare, because obviously that's affecting next generational. Actually, turnout in local elections is a pretty good measure of local engagement. There's a lot of people that only vote when it's president, right? But how many people do people come out and vote for the township or the city council? And that's a positive, if more of them do. And then, again, something I was interested in, having been there, how fiscally sustainable is kind of the whole tax system. So here's some of the projects that you can look at. They were actually, isn't that interesting? I mean, Jacksonville, Florida, who would think like they're cutting edge, but back in the late 80s, they were the first ones to start quality of life indicators. And the impressive thing is they're still doing it. They've done it every year. It was like a collaboration between their Chamber of Commerce and their city council and some nonprofit group. And I don't know, I should go visit sometime to try to figure, but I think it was, again, a little bit of a depressed, for Florida, industrial town. And a lot of, I think it was about 40% African American, a lot of poverty, a lot of racial tensions, and kind of getting ahead of the curve and saying, let's get a grip on kind of what are our strengths and weaknesses and what we can do about it. But they're still doing it. Sustainable Seattle, I have visited that because my son lives there. But what they did, which is pretty interesting, and I mentioned Boston because it's nearby. They're one of the most recent ones, but I'll speed through here. But what they did that was neat, what they've done now in the Sustainable Seattle one is, what's my last slide? They have actually gone beyond, most local governments now use performance indicators. They're comfortable with that, like we're going to measure our police response time and our fire response time and that kind of stuff. But like I know at least when I suggested to them, well, you should be measuring these broader effects in the community, they're like, oh, but we can't control that. We can't control the child poverty rate. They're like, well, yeah, I think everybody's a grown-up. They understand that you can't control the child poverty rate. But these decisions you're making, are they doing things that will tend to move that up or down? That in other words, and actually King County, Seattle has done that now. They have actually integrated these originally private Sustainable Seattle indicators, a lot of them, and they are now looking at it and saying, when we make a decision about where we're going to build a road or how we're going to change zoning or do this, how is it affecting these things about the environment or society or whatever that we think are important, which to me is pretty cool. I'll have to see how it all works. So I know I've got up to the last minute, so I'm going to stop and then I can take like one or two questions, right? Okay.
This town just finished doing a master plan.
Uh-huh.
It's going to appear next month. We talked to the folks in Littleton about gardening.
Oh, really? Okay.
And put a lot of ideas into it.
Yeah.
Some of the economic development things we were thinking about were building on what we already do well.
Yeah.
That means finding out what it is we do well. But this agricultural sustainable things in there. One variation on it, which is sort of in between hunting and gardening.
Uh-huh.
One interesting possibility, this is a home base for a couple of closely held corporations. With national businesses, but they have
Okay.
corporations here because the executives, owners like to live here.
Right?
Is one thing to say, let's make Jane Iredale bigger. Another is to say, let's get another half a dozen Jane Iredales here. Can we make this a sort of a hub for that kind of operation? Let it be more flexibility. I'm not quite sure how to do that. It's been pointed out that the town lacks some of the infrastructure they'd like a car rental company and a few other things that.
Like a what?
A car rental company.
Car rental company, okay. Yeah, things like that can make a difference.
Exactly. But that's intermediate. There are companies that
Yeah.
aren't here yet, we think ought to like to be here if we can get their attention.
Yeah, and I think there I do think there's a role for some kind of economic development office in getting the information out. Because we would think like everybody knows about it, but that really isn't true. And so sometimes just publicizing the information and making sure people know about it. And actually another thing is sort of the one-stop shopping. If you're a business that wants to start here in town, how easy do you have to go to a whole bunch of different offices? Or is there somebody that's kind of an ombudsman that can pull it all together for you? I mean, I think, again, that makes a lot of sense to subsidize that. But, I mean, I think if you could have your choice, you'd rather have more different, was it Jane Iredale?
Jane Iredale is the big.
Yeah. You'd rather have more of them, but, then the question is, how do you get them? But I do think, again, like word gets around, it's like that's a neat place to live, and it's a I think being business friendly in the sense that you the one-stop shopping, you work with them, that's great. What I don't like when business-friendly means like, we're not going to enforce our safety regulations, or like, well, then you're just going to end up with a lot more people in the local hospital, so where did that get you, But there's a good way to be business-friendly that's positive in terms of quality of life too, and so, yeah, I wish you luck.
I just want to mention Gaia.org, G-A-I-A.
Uh-huh.
Have you heard of that?
Mm-hmm.
It's permaculture around the world and working in those different areas of people helping people and promoting education alongside whatever kind of work someone's doing affordably.
Uh-huh.
Which is a new idea. And also, have you heard of 211.org?
No, I haven't.
In any new Connecticut or Massachusetts, you dial 211 and you get 24/7 a social service type person, or you can report a mental health
Oh, I guess, yeah.
and find out.
Right, I think they're starting that everywhere, and yeah, I mean, that's not businesses, but it's just a way to improve quality of life and have things function better for people.
When we don't get the right services early on, it ends up costing us, like people go to ER for,
Absolutely.
So it's about preventive and building that sense
Yeah.
of somebody's a phone call away.
Well, I should tell you all, this is not Everclear. I actually put water in my wine glass. But what I would love to do now is I'm going to go back and get a little real wine, and then maybe we can, do you want to say anything more, Steve, before we, and please help yourself too if you haven't had enough. And I would just love to talk to some of you all just one-on-one, but I know we've used up our time, and some people probably need to go, and yeah.
Great. Well, Daphne, thank you very much for your presentation.